So we're going to keep the conversation going. I think it's been a really great morning so far, and it's been a really wonderful discussion. Eric gave a nice introduction at the very beginning about how the future of research, clinical research, and biomedical research is going to have to involve reaching out directly to patients. And so I wanted to give a brief introduction to one of the projects in which we're exploring that, partnering directly with patients, as a lead into our panel discussion. Many of you have heard some of this before, some of you haven't, and so I just wanted to give an overview of this project, the Metastatic Breast Cancer Project. So as most of you know, and as we've heard already today, our ultimate goal in cancer is to understand what drives it so that we can, for any individual patient, we can interpret all of the relevant genomic and molecular factors involved, identify the optimal patients for a particular individual, and anticipate or preempt resistance before it arises. And the kinds of work that we do here at the Broad Institute, the kinds of work that happen in laboratories all around the world, have made tremendous progress in getting us closer to that goal, but we still have a lot of work to do. And I think we all recognize that by studying samples from patients, studying information from patients, we will get there faster. But it really, to get there, is going to take detailed molecular and genomic characterization of thousands, many thousands of tumor samples, germline samples, medical information, patient-reported information. And this is not something that's been done at a very broad scale to date. We heard some of these statistics from Rachel earlier about why this type of research is so challenging. So only less than 5% of adults in the US are enrolled in clinical trials. And even for patients enrolled in clinical trials, their samples may not be studied, their samples may not be collected. And the vast majority of patients are treated in community centers. 85% by some measures get their care in their local community. And those centers take great care of patients, but don't do research. And that means that a lot of the samples from patients are stored in pathology departments, saved for potential future clinical use, but not studied. And that means that the vast majority of tumor samples and other samples from patients have not been studied, primarily because no one's ever asked patients if they would be willing to contribute them. And as Rachel alluded to in her talk, times are different now. We recognize that with technology and social media and cultural changes, empowered patients and more organized advocacy groups, we have an opportunity now to engage patients directly and partner with them in this type of research and allow patients to really be the ones to go and unlock the potential of their information, their medical information, their samples, in a way that really only they can. And so about 2 years ago, with this idea in mind, we thought about launching a study in metastatic breast cancer to really try and understand if, by partnering with patients, we could really accelerate this type of research. And over the course of about a year, we spent a lot of time meeting with individual patients and patient advocates and advocacy groups to think about what would a partnership like this look like. If we wanted to say we want to empower patients to be able to share their information, how would we do that? And what came out of that year of conversation was the Metastatic Breast Cancer Project and this website at mbcproject.org, which asks patients with metastatic breast cancer if they'd be willing to help transform our understanding of metastatic breast cancer by sharing their information and their samples. And you can see the website goes through and asks people if they want to join. It talks about how they have the potential to unlock discoveries by sharing their information and their samples, and walks people through how they can participate. And to participate, patients go and they click this button, Count Me In, and it asks people to write their name, their email address, and check a box that says, I have metastatic breast cancer, and I would potentially be willing to answer some questions or share my medical records or share my saliva or share my tumor samples. And so we launched this in October of 2015, about now exactly a year and a half ago. And in a year and a half, more than 3,400 women and men from across the country have signed up. There are people in all 50 states. We have people outside the United States as well. And it's been really, there's been really a great amount of support for this study throughout the country. And we've been really encouraged by the number of people who've joined. And so what do we do after people sign up for the study? Well, then we send everyone an online consent form, and the consent form asks for permission to obtain and analyze their medical records, a saliva sample, their stored tumor tissue, and a blood sample now. And once patients sign the consent form, we send them a little box that has a vial in it that they can spit in, and they put it back in the box. The Broad Institute address is already there. There's already postage paid, so it just gets dropped in the mail. They tell us who their doctors are, so then we contact their physicians and ask for copies of their medical records, which are sent here. We read the medical records, we abstract the information, store it in a secure database, but find out where their tissues are stored, and then call the local pathology departments and ask those pathology departments to send us a small piece of the tumor tissue that we can analyze. We do genomic analysis of that tumor and those saliva samples. We do whole exome sequencing, transcriptome sequencing of the tumor. We do exome sequencing of the germline, and we really try to look at the biology of these tumors in the context of the detailed medical information that we get, both by asking questions of the patients who are participating as well as by abstracting the medical records. And then we try to interpret this. And the goal here is really to create this really gigantic and, I would say, unprecedented database that marries genomic and clinical information with medical information and patient-reported data into one big database that all researchers can use to help make discoveries and understand metastatic breast cancer better. And then we report and share all of this. And so the de-identified genomic and clinical data in this database that I described is made accessible to any researcher who wants to use it for their own research projects. And the overall progress and discoveries and findings are communicated back to the patients who are partnering with us in this research regularly through email or through social media or through other means to just make sure that everyone is continually up to speed with where things are and what's next. And so this is another way to look at the enrollment over time to where we are now at 3,400. This blue line is just people who have signed up to date. And I just wanted to point out a couple of things because it highlights the value of this approach of partnering directly with patients. So we launched in October. Can you see my mouse? We launched in October of 2015, as I said, with a bunch of advocacy partners, and we had socialized this online, and so people were waiting for the launch, and we had this really great growth over the first few months of about 800 to 1,000 patients who had signed up. And then things kind of leveled off at the end of 2015. This was Thanksgiving time, and you can see there's a gap where no one signed up during that week. And we presented at the San Antonio Breast Cancer Symposium in 2015, and we got this tiny little bump of maybe 50 people, and then it leveled off again. And then in early 2016, we just started seeing all of these people signing up, and we didn't know why, and it wasn't because we were out there trying to promote the project necessarily. And it turned out that people who had signed up in the first few months of the project, patients, had taken it upon themselves to try and go out there and find other patients to participate. And when we looked, we found Facebook and Twitter posts by people who had signed up for the project, going out and telling others they knew that they had done this, they thought it was important, and they thought it was really easy, and that they should do it as well. And we started, hundreds of people signed up over these first couple of weeks of 2016. A similar jump happened in February, and it turned out there was one patient who went out on her Facebook page, which was very popular, and made this impassioned plea to other patients with metastatic breast cancer that they should sign up, and 300 people signed up in one day, and that was, again, kind of the biggest jump we've had. And really, ever since then, this has been what I like to say a patient-driven movement, with patients being the ones who are going out there and telling others about it and getting people to sign up, and we've really had this steady increase since then. We've had, in January, we started sending out our consent forms, and now more than 2,000 patients with metastatic breast cancer have signed the consent to allow us to obtain and analyze their tumors and their medical records. And saliva samples have been coming in since March, and we now have more than 1,200 saliva samples that are sitting here at the Broad to be analyzed. One of the ideas here, as I said, the vast majority of patients are cared for in the community, not at academic centers, and the goal was to be able to incorporate and allow participation from people no matter where they got their care, and that's bearing out in the data. So right now, of the 3,400 people who have signed up, we represent over 1,000 different institutions and clinics. If this was done as an multi-center study where every center had to go through an IRB, this would be impossible. You can't get 1,000 places to sign up and agree to collaborate on a research study. But because patients are the ones who are signing up and giving permission, you can do this. And we have the usual, big 5 cancer centers who have patients participating as well, but that only accounts for about 220 of the patients in the study, and the vast majority come from these other places, 721 institutions, where just one patient with metastatic breast cancer is participating. Everyone who signs up gets the opportunity to fill out this survey. The survey asks for simple questions. This is going to become important when thinking about Rachel's data that she presented earlier about people's knowledge about their cancer. But the survey asks simple questions, or at least basic questions about their disease, their dates of initial diagnosis with metastatic disease, their receptor status, and some treatment response, questions about whether they've had an extraordinary response to any treatment, some free text, some demographic information, and the opportunity to say more, whatever they want. And so far, this is an optional survey, but 95% of the participants have completed the survey, and although every question can be left blank, the response rate to each question is 98%, and it takes people on average about 6 minutes to complete. So before even doing any actual work with the samples or the medical records, we have detailed patient-reported data answering all these questions on 3,300 patients, which is an incredible resource to be able to start asking questions in metastatic breast cancer. So if we look back at this map and we look at the patient-reported data, sorry, this is off the screen here, we are able to ask questions about groups of patients that might be otherwise hard to study using traditional methods, like patients with extraordinary responses to therapies, or patients with resistance to therapies, or patients who present with advanced disease at diagnosis, or some of these groups of patients who are rarer in metastatic breast cancer, like people diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer at a very young age. And relevant today, this provides an opportunity to include underrepresented groups of patients who have not been part of genomic studies to date. And so we viewed this as a really great opportunity to be able to address many of the issues of disparities that we've been talking about so far today. I'll show you an example of how we're using this patient-reported data. We asked the question, have you been on any therapy in the metastatic setting for more than 2 years? And we asked, have you had any extraordinary responses to therapy? And you can see here 982 people answered yes to this question, and 1,447 people answered yes to that question. So at first we thought maybe this is the wrong question to ask. All these people are saying yes, but because patients are giving us details and saying what drug they got that they had an extraordinary response to, we can actually look and we start finding these groups of patients, small groups of rare patients who have extraordinary responses to particular drugs, certain chemotherapies or platinums or new drugs like PARP inhibitors. And we think that if we study these groups of patients, we might be able to understand why certain people respond well to some drugs, and can we learn something about that we can apply to larger numbers of patients. Similarly, studying people who have been living with metastatic breast cancer for a long time. You can see here that over 150 people in the group have had metastatic breast cancer for more than 10 years. Is there something that we can learn from these people who've been living with metastatic breast cancer for more than 10 years that we might be able to apply to our treatment strategies or the development of future drugs? As I said, all of this information is going to go into databases that others can use the data to share. So all of the data and the linked clinical data will be deposited every 6 months, and we're expecting the first 100 to 200 sample genomic data to be deposited within the next month or two. And we continue to try and expand what we're doing. So we've recently launched this blood biopsy component where, like the saliva kit, we concocted a kit that contains a blood tube, and patients can take it to their phlebotomist or nurse or doctor the next time they're getting a blood draw and ask for this extra tube of blood to be drawn, put in the kit, and come back to us. And that allows us to look at cell-free DNA to study resistance or evolution of tumors in patients with metastatic disease. And you can see here one of the first patients to participate in this. This was when we were piloting this. Posted this on Facebook, where she put the blood tube in the FedEx box, and that came back to us. As I said, this has been a collaboration with patients and advocates. We now have more than 26 different organizations who are advocacy partners, helping us with outreach, helping us think through how we can engage patients better. And as I mentioned, patients and advocates have really been involved since before this project ever launched in conceiving, designing, implementing, testing, and refining the project. And as I said also before, this has been a patient-driven movement. These are pictures that were from maybe 6 months to a year ago. One day online, we just started noticing people were posting selfies, and selfies of themselves with their saliva kits. These say "Count me in," and helping to kind of drive awareness of the project. And I was just going to read 4 of the quotes here from some of our participants. These are just represented. We hear things like this all the time about what it means to patients to be able to participate directly in this type of work. I want to live and watch my children grow up, but if I can't, then I want to leave a legacy and a cure. As someone who does not live near a research center and therefore cannot easily participate in trials, I feel like I can finally contribute. Amazing how happy that little box makes you feel. I felt like a 2-year-old. Let me help. I feel a sense of pride and belonging because of this, and giving us hope for the future, if not for some of us, for our families. And so this is a model we're excited about, to be able to partner directly with patients, and we want to do this in other cancers. And so several weeks ago, the second example of a project reaching out to patients with cancer was launched. The angiosarcoma project, and already hundreds of people with angiosarcoma, which is a very rare type of cancer, have signed up for this. And the prostate cancer project, we hope to launch sometime in the next few months. And in cancer and beyond cancer, we're hoping that this type of approach is going to really help engage patients and try and increase the number of people participating in this type of translational and biomedical research. So I'm going to pivot to introducing the panel in a second, but before I do that, I just want to acknowledge the folks in the Metastatic Breast Cancer Project team, in particular this group in red here who spend every day working on these projects and thinking about it, but also the very many people at the Broad and the Dana-Farber and elsewhere who have been involved in helping set this up and continuing to run it. And also all of the advocacy groups and the many advocates and patients who have been working on this project, and all the patients with metastatic breast cancer who participate in this project. So with that introduction to the MBC project, I want to come back to this map. And as I mentioned, projects like this, where we reach directly to patients and we can engage people from all over the country or even beyond the country, have the potential to address many of the issues that we talked about today, right? Because we are reaching out directly to patients, because we are not going through institutions particularly, because we can avoid some of the barriers that we heard about today. These studies, our hope was and is that these types of studies would be able to allow us to reach out directly to communities who have been underrepresented or who are underrepresented. And at the same time, as we're looking at the data that we've collected, we realize that we are not effectively doing that yet. So I'm going to show you, I mentioned that we answered 2 questions about race and demographics in the Metastatic Breast Cancer Project. And so here are the answers. We have over 3,200 patients who've answered this question. The question we asked is, what is your race? Select all that apply. And 3,026 respondents, or 92%, selected white. And this is the distribution of answers who selected answers other than white. And you can see the y-axis here, if you can't read, that's 3%. That's 3.5%. And so other is the next highest at 3.5%, Black or African American at 2.7%, and everyone else even less than that. And the answer to the question, do you consider yourself Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish? 5% answered yes, and 95% no. And so, although we have the ability, I think, to use these types of approaches to help address issues of disparities and differences in participation, we're not doing that yet. And so, part of the conversation today is about how we might use these tools, which I think are incredibly powerful, but to use them to address some of the issues that we talked about today. And so with that introduction, I'd like to invite our panel to come up. and I'll introduce them briefly, and then for the next about hour or so, just have a conversation about all of the issues we talked about today, and in particular how we might engage patients around the country from underrepresented communities to participate in this type of work. So can I invite the panel to come up, please? So I'll just give everyone a kind of brief introduction, and then we'll dive in. So we have Angela Baker, who's an MBC Project patient and patient advocate from North Carolina. Just raise your hand. And Margaret Flowers, who's the Associate Director of Grants and Scientific Communications from the Breast Cancer Research Foundation. There's Margaret here. Bridget Hempstead, who's a metastatic breast cancer project patient and the CEO and founder of Sierra Sisters, one of our advocacy partners, who comes to us from Seattle. Sheila McGlown, a MBC Project patient and a patient advocate from St. Louis. Sean Johnson, who's a researcher at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. And Terry Livingston, the head of innovation and external partnerships and senior director of U.S. Medical at Biogen. And LaTanya Wilson, MBC Project patient and patient advocate, coming to us from South Carolina. Did I get everyone? Good. So I thought maybe we could start talking to some of the MBC Project patients and just asking about, we heard this morning a lot about research participation and perceptions, and maybe each of you could just tell us briefly about your experiences with participating in research or thinking about participating in research over the last few years. Maybe we can start on this end. Bridget, can you start?
Well, as I shared earlier, I've been advocating and sharing information about research to my community for over 21 years. And when I was faced with metastatic disease, and I asked for research from my previous doctor, and that doctor absolutely flat out refused to allow me to go into a clinical trial, and which I have the right to do that. So of course I switched doctors and now NED, and I'm in a clinical trial. So I'm finding that the barriers for our community to get into clinical trials may not only be on the fact that they don't know about it, but doctors who are resistant to allow their patients to get in it.
My experience has been, I was MBC de novo, found out December 2nd, and I instantly went on Herceptin. I've been on Herceptin for 7 years. So my thought process was, well, somebody had to be on a clinical trial for me to be able to survive this long with MBC, which is working, I've had a great response to it. And I think that it's very important that our community, my community, knows about clinical trials. It starts somewhere. My community wants a cure. You want a cure, but you don't want to participate in clinical trials. So for me, my job and my advocacy is to get into the communities, every community, and say, hey, I've had a great response. I went to, these the Broad Institute, and we talked about racial disparities. And I think it's important that people see Black women doing what we are doing. When my mom was diagnosed and she passed in 2004 from MBC, I didn't even know Black women got breast cancer. I didn't know. And I wish back then I knew about clinical trials, because maybe she could have got on a clinical trial back then. So I just think that it's important that we have that engagement and we have that talk on a daily basis of, and I think it starts with the doctor and the patient. If patients know about clinical trials or even the understanding or even the website, they can have a better dialogue with their doctors. And I got involved with the MBC Project because I think it's important. I want to know why I'm having a great response to Herceptin, and I've been on Flazodex for the past 3.5 years. I want to know why 3 years before Tykerb worked for me, I've been on Cadcyla. That worked for me as well. So I think it's important that we know these results, and we're better to help the African American, not only the African American community, but communities as a whole.
Angela.
Hi, I'm Angela, and I've been on Flazodex my entire MBC experience, and it's working, and it has always worked, and I'm NED. However, I question, is there something else that's better than Flazodex? Am I going to stay on Flazodex until, suddenly it's no longer working, and then my doctor's screaming to see what's going to work next? Or I question, is there something better that's a trial, like maybe that has less side effects, but just as good? And should I try it? And with the research for me, and just if I know more about trials and more about what else can help, I can better inform my community. One of the patients that I worked with my nonprofit, she was secretive. She said I can go to the doctor with her, but she really didn't tell her family, like, really the extent of her MBC, and it had spread to her stomach, and I also didn't know it. I would just ask a lot of questions, and I think she was on Flazodex as well. But if I knew a little bit more, I could have said, well, did you try this trial? Or, let's ask your doctor about this. But in the end, she just started refusing treatment because, maybe she was giving up. But if she knew, and going back to being secretive as an African American, why didn't she share this with her family? So I wish that I would know a lot more about the trials. Is my doctor really giving me the best treatment? Yes, I'm NED, but I know that could change tomorrow. So I just want to be more informed so I can help someone else.
Hello, I'm LaTanya. This is my third time I've been diagnosed with breast cancer. I was just diagnosed last year with MBC. And so for me, being kind of young still, and this is my third time, whenever you're diagnosed stage 4, you're thinking that you're gonna die. So with me, I'm a fighter. So I just want to make sure I get the proper treatments in case one thing doesn't work. And since cancer doesn't run in my family at all, I'm the first person. It doesn't run in my family at all. So I want to make sure that I understand the different treatments, so that way if someone else I run into, which I always run into a lot of people, if one thing doesn't work, then you have another avenue that you can do, another treatment that you can do. So I want to educate myself a little bit more so I can be able to help out the next person. And if mine doesn't work, we are kind of in charge of our own medical. So I want to be able to tell my doctor, if this doesn't work, okay, well, I want to do this. Sometimes they don't know. And I'm from South Carolina. I'm from the country. So, yeah, somebody laughed at me. But sometimes, they don't know a lot of things that go on, because up north, this is where a lot of clinical trials happen at. We don't get a lot of this stuff down south. So that way, if something doesn't work, I can be able to let her know, hey, I heard about this, I heard about that. I'm going to do it whether or not if you agree or not, because this is my life. So that's why, and then being in the military, and traveling all over the place, I'm a little bit diverse. So it's not hard for me to trust certain things because this is my life. So I just want to be able to help out the next person and to continue to help out myself and help out my family.
Margaret and Terry and Sean, could you just share some introductory thoughts about reflecting on what we heard this morning and what we in the research community might do to address some of these things? Then we'll do some back and forth and get some questions from the audience as well.
I'll start. I'm obviously Margaret, and I'm here as a scientist, but I'm also an advocate. I'm a trained scientist, but I didn't actually obtain that training until much later in my life. I lost my mother to metastatic breast cancer 25 years ago, and I was quite young, and I was her caregiver at the end of her life, and I was in my early 30s at the time, and it was just a shattering experience for me not to really be able to help someone that I loved. And it was a life-changing experience for me. After that event, and my mother passed away, I went about my life. But some years later, maybe about a decade later, I really made the decision that I wanted to do something to. I just wanted to respond to that, and I felt the need to do that. And I ended up going back to school in my 40s to get my bachelor's. I had never gone to college, and went on to my PhD because I really wanted to do breast cancer research. A very naive move on my part, but it brought me into it really brought me into the nonprofit space. I did my training, and after that realized that I was a little bit late getting started into an academic research career, but it did bring me into the nonprofit sector, which ultimately really connected me to the mission that I was originally pursuing, and that is to make a difference in breast cancer. And as a nonprofit worker and part of the Breast Cancer Research Foundation, I have a lot of contact with the scientists and the clinicians who are running these clinical trials. A lot of them are clinical trialists. A lot of them are working in the disparities field and in other, access care and the genomics and the biology of disparities, as well as just some of the cultural and geographical barriers of care. But I also have a lot of contact with patients through the Metastatic Breast Cancer Alliance and BCRF's involvement with that group. And I think that the opening discussions that we heard this morning, which were absolutely fabulous in setting the context for this discussion. We've known about the disparities for a really, really long time, and we actually also know how to address them, but the barriers that are in place are really the challenge. And I know that the clinical scientists who are trying to recruit minorities into their trials really want to recruit those minorities, and it's not just a numbers game. It's really about making a difference for all breast cancer patients. And it's not just a federal mandate that says they have to have minority representation. It's really their pledge to really make a difference in the space. And some of the barriers that they face really are at the institutional level, and so we have to change that culture, but also that changing and addressing the disparities. We know that it's not just access to care. Science has shown, and we know that there are biological differences in the incidence and that are driving some of the incidence and outcomes in breast cancer and other cancers in minority groups. But we also know, and science also shows, that the disparity is really, really fundamentally about access. When reports show that disparities in certain cities, Boston one of them, certain cities has grown, that cannot be but explained by biology. And so it's really important that the communities that are facing these disparities address them as communities. And I think we know that, and it was explained in the presentations this morning. We know that, but it's the tools. It's getting the stakeholders and the constituents together. And I think the Boston Breast Cancer Equity Consortium is a really, really fabulous start for the Boston area. And so I think I'll just leave it there and wait for the discussion. Thank you.
Terry, can you tell us maybe some of your thoughts about what you've done and ways that have worked to reach out to communities?
Sure. So I'm a researcher at Biogen. We don't have oncology products, but I think what we're doing certainly is applicable for any disease state. So I actually think that clinical trials are run by pharmaceutical companies, and I think it's our responsibility to address this issue. And so at least within Biogen, what we've done is our belief is that it has to be embedded in the culture, right? It has to be part of the fabric, the DNA of the company. And so I know we have a diversity and inclusion department who embeds it in our culture across our employees, right? It starts there, top down. Everyone has to embrace diversity and inclusion. The next step that we've taken from there is then to expand that to our patients and our providers. And so what we've done is to generate this whole framework of how can we include and reach out to those of, that are the racial and ethnic minorities. For us, it's MS. We have some other neurological disorders like Alzheimer's. We have some immunology diseases like lupus, right? If we aren't able to engage and enroll African Americans, Hispanics, especially in some of the diseases like lupus, our clinical trials will not be successful, right? Because we have to understand the incidence of these different diseases and who they affect. And I can share with you, like in MS, it's thought to be a predominantly, Caucasian female. That's not true anymore. The demographics of the U.S. have changed. The actual risk of MS in the U.S. is highest now in Black women, right? And so we need, and yet in our clinical trials, less than 10% of the patients across all of our clinical trials, we have 5 MS products, less than 10% have enrolled minority patient populations. So we haven't done a great job. And so I think what we've tried to do is to first start to collect race and ethnicity, because we weren't doing that. So that's standard across all of our trials now. And then how do we then develop programs in which we can go out into the community, and it is, to what you had said, it is a community approach. And so going to understanding and being culturally competent, going into the communities, and understanding where, who are the leaders. So for African Americans, what we've done is gone to the churches. Hispanics, they go to the YMCAs, right? So you host these programs to try to raise awareness around clinical trials and educate around the need for them to participate. And so we've actually taken the programs to, first reach out to the leaders within that community, and then host these programs to do the education and why it's important to participate. And so we found that that's been very successful. And so if we, again, can build that into the framework of how we just operate and do our clinical trials, I think that will be more successful. And then I think to get to the numbers, right, it's disappointing to hear that you actually were not accepted. What we can do within our clinical trials is to say X amount of patients need to be from African American or Hispanic, right? So that you do get those numbers in your trials. And then the other is, because you can't say you can't say it's going to be just focused in minority populations, because that's not ethical. But what you can do is you can identify sites that have a larger Hispanic African American population, most of the big cities, and make sure that you have those centers participate, right? So those are some of the things that we've done at Biogen. And again, we've started with MS, but we're certainly trying to build that framework so that we can expand it into our other disease states, and actually have done so in Alzheimer's.
Great. Sean?
So I think why I'm on this panel has been something that I've wondered a lot. And I think I kind of have an idea. So I first started working with Nick and Corey about maybe like half a year ago. And one of my interests for a long time has been why the story of what I was told about science was so different from what I grew up with. So we talked a lot about patient-physician mistrust today, and And I would say my family is a bit maybe more on the distrustful side of the spectrum. So one story I tell people a lot is when I was younger, I was home at a family reunion, and my uncle, who is a very, very colorful guy, it's not a pun, told me that he was convinced that the restaurants in the Bay Area, and it's a very specific part of the Bay Area because it's very gentrified now, were testing male birth control in the beverages in fast food restaurants, which sounds ridiculous, right? I tell people this a lot, and they go, oh, that's like, he must have been like a conspiracy theorist. He wasn't. This was the only types of say, conspiracies that he really believed in were related to the medical system and the UC system in particular. The other sort of anecdotal story I'd bring up is when I first moved to Boston 5 years ago, my barber, this guy D out in Dudley, when I told him what I did, he was convinced that Dana-Farber had a cure for cancer, right? And these are things that people often sort of hear, maybe like online, people talk about how the government is responsible for giving people HIV or is hiding a cure for cancer. But for him, this was very real. But it was sort of uniquely relevant just to medicine. It wasn't like I would come in and he would tell me that he had seen UFOs the next weekend. Like, it was just that he had this really profound distrust of the medical system. And what for me was so frustrating was that what I grew up with, my family's experiences, my family's beliefs in some of these things were immediately discounted from what we would consider the scientific side of medicine. So going through university, I never once heard a lot of what Dr. Hammond mentioned today about the fact that, say, if you're a student, you're interested in medicine, how aware are you of the fact that most anatomical knowledge came from the desecration and dismemberment of black bodies, that medical schools, the same way they advertise today about their simulation centers, advertised about the fact that sharecroppers and slaves were very proximal to their medical school sites, and that if you were a medical student, you could have a fun time digging up black bodies for anatomical research. I took a tour at the Harvard College, the tour where the people talk like they're from the 1800s, and they told this story of grave robbing very jovially. It was like a funny tale. And it's always sort of been, from my experience, this sort of dichotomous differentiation where the community that I come from has these fears and has these concerns. And a lot of time, I think on our side, I guess my other half that's in medicine, writes it off because what we grew up with in what we learn in school is this idea that medicine is fundamentally a force for good. And the reason why I got involved in the project is that I personally think it's incredibly dangerous to go into these spaces and to go into these communities without being aware of what that history is. So you can see this everywhere from education to the financial system. There's a great story of the school in Boston that was trying to represent their students better because they had a large Haitian population, and one of the teachers did a day celebrating Cinco de Mayo. None of the kids knew what, it was not relevant to any of their background, right? And so you see this a lot in medicine where there's this idea that we need to educate black patients. We need to convince them that these things don't happen anymore and that we don't experiment on patients. But what do you do when you, let's say, talk to someone like my uncle who believes that people are being forcibly sterilized, and you tell them that's not true, but then in 2013 in California, you find out that female inmates were being forcibly sterilized. When you find out that migrant women are giving consent forms in English and are also getting forcibly sterilized. When you find out that fenfluramine was given by Columbia, the medical center, to young black boys in Harlem who were identified through the justice system because their brothers were in either drug rehab or were in the juvie system, and they were identified because they might be genetically at risk for violence or for a predisposition to violence. So when you go into these spaces and we sort of ignore this history about where we came from, we really run this risk of not just fixing this issue of trust, but by making it worse, because we end up sort of flagrantly lying to people by not recognizing this past. And so my interest for a long time has been to talk about race in medicine, to not sort of hedge around these issues, talk about how these things are all in the past and how it's okay, like you can trust the medical system because we're fundamentally a force for good, and to actually tell patients to validate their concerns and say, no, like this wasn't just Tuskegee, this is the foundation of most American medicine, and the things that you feel are not irrational and they're not crazy, but maybe I need to learn more about that. Maybe I need to understand how implicit bias and how sort of these subconscious implications that black women might not want to enroll in clinical trials, which is a widely studied issue, this idea that physicians are much more recalcitrant to offer minority patients clinical trials, the fact that medical students are still reported to believe that Black women and Black men experience pain or don't experience pain at the same rates as white patients do, that Hispanic women are sometimes considered to be more hysteric, so their side effects are actually not real physiological things, it's just a cultural predisposition they have. How do we, on the medical side, start addressing the fact that the institution that we work in is fundamentally rooted in racism and abuse, and while we might not be practicing it explicitly today, a lot of the practices that we still have now are implicit, and the community knows that, and the community wants people to address that. So I think that I'm on this panel because I've very much been an advocate for talking about race and talking about things that happen in history and taking ownership for the fact that this great system that we all benefit from, I'm sure everybody here loves science, they probably love being at a great place like the Broad, but you're also responsible for, and you, me, are responsible for these things that these institutions did before. And so the same way that you can't ignore the fact that Harvard and MIT have gentrified Mission Hill and forced out families from the communities they used to live in, you also can't ignore the fact that the medical establishment created these issues. And it's, for my woke younger colleagues out there, like, this is as big of an issue as anything else you might think is going on with the election or other communities that you don't associate with.
So that's a great lead into my next question, actually, for the whole panel. And please feel free to raise your hands or come up to the mic if you want to ask a question or make a comment. So with that in mind and thinking about this morning's two talks, how do we, as researchers or as advocates or as patients, acknowledge this history? And when do we do it? And when should we do it? Anyone on the panel can take that.
Well, going back to what you stated about putting together educational events and going into the community. We always talk about it, but when it's going to happen? Yeah. The longer you keep waiting, then the worse it's going to get. So we all say we want to educate, we want to get the African American community on board, but when is it going to happen?
Yeah, I think, and so one of the issues I would say, and this sort of gets back to the question that I was asking Dr. Friedman, is there has to be at some point a real effort to stop using Tuskegee as point 18 on the research checklist and really start talking about what this history means. Because what I found in my experience is that people don't go into the community because they recognize the issue and don't want to do it. It's because people really don't fundamentally understand how entrenched abuse and marginalization and racism is in medicine. And so when we did that talk when you guys all came out, so we had this day where we really talked about everything from the fact that when we talk about physicians owning slaves and doing experimental trials, these weren't physicians owning slaves and giving them 1800s version of Herceptin. These were physicians owning slaves in dismembering slaves. It was putting people in heat pits and seeing how long until they passed out. Real things that eventually ended up, even if people don't know the specifics about those events anymore, and the community made such a sort of notion of fear around physicians that there are literally poems and sort of songs that like sharecroppers and physicians or slaves used to tell about the terrors of medical professionals. These were basically the same way that we talk about, say, the Klan or the White Shirts or the Red League in the redemption area. The physicians were effectively a terrorist group in these communities. And so until we get people to understand how deep this problem is, how sort of messed up 300 years of abuse is, and how these things, again, are not just people being irrational. And so it's like, okay, well, maybe if I go out there, I'll get to it eventually, but these people are kind of being silly, so it's not that big of an issue. If you could teach physicians, I think, and students and researchers how deep this problem is, I think that's a large part of it. So what I would say is that there has to be a lot less focus on educating patients and more focus on educating people who exist in this system about what their background is.
So I can add to that, and I totally agree. And at Biogen, what we have done is not just patients, but also providers, right? And so so what we've done is supported educational programs about the importance of unconscious bias, of being culturally competent themselves, and that just again a broader understanding of some of the issues that you guys all have raised, and what those barriers to care are, and how, and also then, because what we've learned is through doing surveys and outreach to African Americans and Hispanics about what those barriers to care are, and what is it that's holding them back. A lot of it's around being, again, culturally competent. So how can we help be able to support African American physicians support them in their schooling? So support fellowships, right, that are focused on bringing minority physicians into neurological disorders, whether it's African Americans or Hispanics, because if you go out there and do these programs and it's somebody that looks like you, right, that gets at some of the trust, right? Because now you have somebody that's speaking to you that kind of can understand and relate. Same with Hispanics. You want somebody who can speak Spanish, right? You have the programs that are in Spanish. So have a Hispanic physician doing that program, speaking Spanish. And again, that goes a long way to break down that barrier and that mistrust that I think not only that exists in African Americans, Hispanics, and Asians. I also happen to be a patient advocate as well. I happen to have MS, and so that's why I'm very passionate about this. And so I do think that, right, I think it spans all minorities, and I do believe and agree with you that we do have to do a better job with our providers. And so, for us, again, we're only one company though, right? But if other companies can take this same approach, that it's our responsibility to ensure that we are including patients into our clinical trials, but helping to educate our providers about, the unconscious bias that occurs and the need to be culturally competent, and us then supporting it through these type of programs. At least that's that first step forward, and hopefully others can join in trying to do these type of initiatives as well.
We have two, Margaret, and then we have a comment here and a comment here.
Oh, I'm sorry. So I just really wanted to quickly follow up on the point about the minority doctors, and I think it's really important to stress here that training and developing training programs for minority students to get them engaged in research and disparities research to really light up that passion in them, because that really is going to that's going to increase the presence in the field of oncology and in the field of research, and break down some of those barriers in the minority communities, and that is still something that we're not doing a very good job at. So really getting the young high school and undergraduate students really interested in pursuing careers in not only medicine, but research, clinical research, and in the disparities field, to not only go back to their communities and serve as doctors, but go back to their communities and really try and understand the underlying problems that are driving the disparities in their community outcomes.
Comment here at the mic. Sorry, let's take a comment from there, and then Bridget will come to you.
Hi. So I want to thank all of you, actually, for being on the panel. Sean, you said something really important, I think, for all the reason why we're here today, and that I think gets to the origin of a lot of the disparities. You talked about stories. Evelyn talked a lot about stories too. So there's a sense that, within African American traditions, there are these stories, and the stories arose out of circumstances, and they have different cultural expressions in songs and other forms. And I think one of the things that I think about a lot is that science also has stories. And I think one of the problems is that we tend to see science as storyless, that science is somehow not just a force of good, but actually neutral to group membership, universal, not partial, a meritocracy, the best ideas rise to the top, all of that. And so and I think that that's very important for a place like the Broad, and people who work here and that we work with, because one of the big stories that science tells itself is that it's neutral. So like Black people over here have the stories and science has science. And so I just wondered if you all could speak to that from your own perspectives, because I feel like it's important, and it gets to the issue of, not just the fact that, not just a narrative of like, we have to explain to Black people or to people of color why this is good for them, because their stories blind them to things, but that the stories that science has told about itself blind scientists to things, and that the realities of people of color and their encounters with the medical establishment have a lot to teach scientists about the things that they are blind to because of their stories.
Yes, so, or you can actually go first.
So one of the things I want to say is I think all the comments and everything, all the conferences are wonderful. We get great information. We're sharing our stories here. Research projects are going on. But what happens after the conference? Of course, we're doing Twitter, Facebook, and all these other things. And we talk about how important it is for us to go into communities. The advocates, we're out in the communities, but are the scientists and researchers and the doctors, are they coming with us? After the conferences, what happens? They go back to their classes, they go back to their office, they're sitting at their laptops, they're doing their work. Those are very important things. But if we're gonna talk about breaking the barrier issues that are out there and demystifying the fears that are out there and really hitting some real issues, you gotta come with us. You gotta, after these conferences, commit, get uncomfortable, and go into an uncomfortable place and go into the churches and go into the communities and find a group that you can go and talk with and be vulnerable, that they may push back because they're angry about what has happened in the community. But I challenge each and every one of you in the next month, go out into the community. Make a difference that you're learning about. Make a difference in what you're talking about right here. Go out and save a life by talking to them in the community.
And I just want to piggyback on what she's saying, because I'm sitting here, like, I live in Charlotte, which is not the capital of North Carolina, but it's a very large city in North Carolina, and it has a lot, it's big on healthcare. And I'm like, but nobody talks about it. Like LaTanya said, all the research is really up north, and the trials and the clinics, and I'm like, okay, I have a little small nonprofit organization. I know these other organizations in Charlotte, and now I'm like, okay, who can I go to, and who can I get to come with me to go out into the communities, because we don't need to sit another month, another year, whatever. Like, when I get home, I'm like, I'm ready to go, and who should I go to first?
Rachel, and then comment here.
Posing questions back to you, because I actually go to a lot of community talks and just talk about breast cancer awareness and screening, because I feel if I started to talk about clinical trials to a group of people who don't have cancer, who are healthy, who are living their lives, I actually find the moment to talk about some of these things is very hard to find. And I'm curious what you all think is the most helpful thing to do when you're in the community, because I go to, I've gone to a lot of community sites to just talk about breast cancer awareness and what cancer is, and just trying to show them that Dana-Farber is a friendly place and we're here for you and you need us. But I'm not sure that that's the right message or helpful or is really going to get us somewhere. So I'm curious what you all think is the right moment to have some of these conversations.
I think bringing along an MBC patient and saying, having them talk about clinical trials with you, I think that would be good. Because in the African American community, we only react when we see what's relatable, as I think LaToya said. So if it's relatable to them, they're going to act. And it's just the way it is. It's just our culture. My mom, she never talked about breast cancer. She never let us go to treatments with her. She never, she had a doctor appointment, we would have to sit in the waiting room and wait for her. So I don't know I always say, well, is she being selfish? No, it's just in her culture just not to talk about it. And it's just in our culture that we don't talk about being sick. So I would say to you, just have someone there with you where it's relatable that, okay, a clinical trial, this young lady has breast cancer and she was on a clinical trial, or introducing clinical trials, because you can always introduce, clinical trials at any point, whether they're interested or not, But I think it's good. I think it's something to talk about, because you never know. They might have a friend that's stage 4 that could benefit from the clinical trial, or they may have a friend that's stage 1 that could benefit from a clinical trial. So I think it's, one thing, my doctor, with stage 4, I was HER2 positive, and some of the side effects I talked to her with, she never knew in 7 years that I was having these side effects. So I talked to her about it, and in 2 weeks, I'll be on the clinical trial for the symptom that I was having. But she never knew. So out of the blue, 2 weeks ago, she called and she said, oh my gosh, Sheila, because she's a little Asian woman. She said, oh my gosh, Sheila, it's a clinical trial, and it's gonna help you, and I want you to get involved. And my plastic surgeon called and said, okay, it's free, and the 3,000 women that they've helped, it all worked. So I was excited about that. So it's just getting out to the communities to say, but it has to be a relatable way to do it. Church is our foundation, and it's just the way it is. And that's the way that we react, getting our church leaders together and just saying, hey, this is a very important topic. And just like she said, once we leave here, like, what are we gonna do? What's our next step? But the most important part for me is our doctors. Our doctors have to communicate this to patients. I go to WashU, so I'm always head of the game, because my doctor's in charge of clinical trials, so she always talks to me about it. But for other patients, like in East St. Louis, that go to a clinic, they're not getting the same information. They're asking me, like, what's Herceptin? I never heard of that. And then they go back to their doctors. So it's just having a dialogue, So anytime you want to, I would just say I think there's always a good time to talk about clinical trials, because nobody knows about it.
Comment here at the mic.
Actually, that kind of got a little bit at what I was going to ask, which was, because I do the sort of, I actually do outreach, but in the form of bringing young like middle schoolers from underserved communities to like UC Irvine, and showing them labs and teaching them about how to get to college and stuff. But in trying to do outreach to like where we go and actually talk to like the parents and stuff, it's a little bit difficult to know what is the information that they actually want. Like I know this is asking, I guess, more for the people who are not researchers, is like, what is it that exactly that we should be bringing to you? And you were starting to answer that, was, bring someone with you who can make, the research relatable. But I was wondering if you guys had any more comments of the kind of stuff that you actually wish you had heard or want to actually hear from researchers who are trying to do that outreach.
I wish I would have learned off the bat about clinical trials, in which I didn't know. And the 2 that I was supposed to get in, I end up being not qualified for, because actually the Herceptin has shrunk. Actually, TDM1 has shrunk my cancer. So then she tried to get me in a clinical trial, but my cancer had shrunk too much or whatever, which was a blessing, but which was good. So she tried to get me into one, but it's just, like I said, it's just talk about it. There's never a right or wrong way or right or wrong time to talk about clinical trial, or to talk about cancer, period, or to talk about the research that you're doing. Even if it's just going into community, the Broad Institute going into a community that's underserved. African American, we're the most underserved community out there. And we're dying at a faster rate. And just making those points that, okay, your community is dying at a faster rate, but I want you to understand, and I want you to know all the clinical trials and all the things that are going on within the breast cancer or the cancer community, period. Because I hear a lot, like somebody said, well, we got a cure. No, we don't have a cure. There is no cure. There is no cure. And I was arguing with somebody the other day, well, they got a cure in the government. No. I know a lot of researchers are working their butts off, and I went over to the Broad, and they got all this writing up on the window. I'm like, they doing something over there. So no, we don't have a cure.
One of the things I would say, you were saying that you go out into the community, talk about breast cancer, but you can always have a message within a message. That may be the forefront of what you are talking about, but you can always add other things into that talk and making sure that you have your community leaders on board when you're out there, and then ask them if they would be a part of the call to action and share this information with their own community networks.
But I took my Count Me In package into my doctor, and I was like, have you heard of the MBC Project? And she was like, well, no. Then I asked her, I said, well, should I join? I mean, should I send my saliva? What are they gonna do with it? And she said, no, you could do it. And and I think my job now is to go into Stikeman Cancer Center and meet with oncologists and explain the MBC Project to them, because they didn't know about it, which is okay, but then that's my job to go in and say, hey, can I meet with all the oncologists or doctors or whatever and explain to you what the MBC Project is? And then maybe it'll get bigger and maybe it'll reach further to the African American women that they're dealing with, patients, or to women all over, So that's what I'm gonna do when I go back to my community, is say, hey, Dr. Ma, can we, I set up something to where I can talk about the MBC Project, and that way it's a broader reach.
And like Sheila said, how her doctor, she's going to start a new trial. And like I say, yes, I'm NED, but how come no one's talking to me about a trial? Is it just like, oh, you're doing wonderful, things look good, your tumors are great, da-da-da-da-da, and wait until they're not great? Or do my side effects not matter? Like, I had some side effects for like 4 months. Like, I didn't know what was going on with me. I was gaining weight, I was doing this, I was doing that, and I kept asking the oncologist, and she wanted to send me for a brain scan, a this scan, a that scan. And then I found out that it was my thyroid not working, and I was like, you're an oncologist and you didn't know to check my thyroid? Like, to me, your degree, your education is higher than my general practitioner, and she's the one that knew to check my thyroid. Is it because she's an African American and my oncologist is white and you didn't think I deserved it? Or, I mean, you kind of like, I don't know.
It's disappointing.
Yeah, disappointed, and I'm like I say, talk to me. Do I ever need a trial, or should I ever look at a trial? Don't just keep saying everything looks great. See you in 6 months, and then I have to come in and say, oh, I'm having this awful pain, and then now you want to give me scans every, So I just want to talk about it a lot more in Charlotte.
I just wanted to offer a comment. As I'm listening to all of our voices up here, I'm wondering if there's an opportunity, and maybe there's something that already exists, for an advocacy toolkit that you all could put together that would help, that organizations or projects like the MBC Project, and clinicians who are working in the minority, recruiting minority patients and trying to get that representation up. A toolkit on, how to be culturally appropriate, and just how to approach this. Because unfortunately, in most cases, it's going to be a white doctor and an African American or a person of color in those situations. And so if there can be some kind of a toolkit from the community to sort of help that clinician or that oncologist to it goes back to that bi-directional training, but actually have an experienced and informed advocate component really develop, thoughtfully develop that would be, I don't know, that's just a suggestion, might be out there, but.
So one of the things that I did develop was a toolkit that was funded by the Health Disparities group in Seattle at Fred Hutch and also NCI. And so it's an evidence-based toolkit designed by African-American women for the African-American community. That's just one example. But I think a lot of times when these different programs or toolkits are developed, they're not by the community members that they want to do outreach to. I think that's the biggest problem. And so we've got individuals in Washington now that are trained by that from this project that I did there, and they're able to go out into the community and they have add MBC to that. However, I think it would be a wonderful thing if Dana-Farber would develop that particular toolkit for this particular project and making sure that you have your African Americans that are involved in it so that it's not just done by Caucasians that are in the field here. And it's going to be very relevant that they see that it is not just by white researchers and scientists that are pushing this project out.
So is there a comment here at the mic?
I'm a little too short for the mic, so I'll just project. So one of the things that I would love to hear us talk about, that I feel like this is kind of a two-pronged approach to treating these disparities. We've talked a lot about community, but one of the things I would love for us to talk about is in the scientific community, holding our colleagues accountable. So the question brought up about shoring up numbers. The question you brought up about, making this not a niche conversation. The experiences that you had where your primary care physician and your oncologist weren't really seeing eye to eye on what you needed. That comes from colleagues holding colleagues accountable, and we have to do both. So I think that's an important part of this discussion. And the other thing that I would love to talk about too is how we treat Native American populations. So I think that as far as your experiences with the Black community, there's a lot of parallels that go to that, and I think that there's also a lot of trust to be had going to Native American populations with your experiences. So hopefully that's something we can get from this too.
Well, you are so correct, and we've done a lot of outreach in Seattle and on the Native land, and it's a whole different community, it's a whole different world, because now you're dealing with classism within the culture on the Native in the Native community, and it is a big issue because we're talking about outside going in, and already there's a disparity, and then there's within their own community there's a huge disparity as well.
And one of the things that I see too in research that I hope that we can get a little bit more maybe granular on it is when we talk about Hispanic communities, non-white Hispanic communities, we're not addressing the fact that that is Native American. And that the conversations will benefit both Northern American natives and Southern American natives because there are similarities with genes in that. So definitely, hopefully we can talk about that too.
Thank you.
Thanks.
If I could
Yeah, please.
just add, so again, I apologize, we're not an oncology company, but so we are doing that. So we are trying to develop, a program for our providers and how they can be culturally competent within MS. It's important to develop tools that speak to the different patient, different race and ethnicities. So simple things like pictures, right, of African Americans, Blacks on the tools that when you go to that program, it shouldn't be a picture of a Caucasian female. It should be representative of the community you're going to. Also, for the Hispanics, you touched upon the differences in Hispanic populations. In MS, it does matter where you're from, right? The origin not all Hispanics are the same. Are they from Mexico? Are they from Spain? Are they from Puerto Rico? That all is important, not only in the tools and the language in the tools, right? How you communicate it, because there are differences in just the way people say things, but also their just beliefs. So if you can get at and address their beliefs, whether it's religion, whether it's, again, the stigma, address it head on, and try to incorporate that into the tools and materials that you provide so that they know, again, you understand them, right? So I think those are some of the things that we have found that have been helpful. What was I going to say? Shoot.
Well, maybe.
So I think one thing that I would definitely add on that is there really needs to be a real fundamental effort to address implicit bias in medical practice. This is something that has been studied quantitatively over and over and over again, but I think the problem is that for people who have never experienced it, it's a very sort of odd concept. But if you look at a lot of the qualitative data about how, say, black patients talk about how their white physicians treat them, I think sometimes we talk about this issue that black patients prefer black physicians as if it's like just a random thing, like that, I don't know, that they think they're all related or something stupid. Like it's really talked about in this like really kind of like dumb way, like they just randomly want a black physician. And that's not the case. Like what you have to understand is that medicine, in the financial system, in the criminal justice system, like these are all systems that people group together. And so if you are a black patient and you spent 25 years of your life being condescended to and having your physician sort of act weird around you, not feel comfortable touching you, like people study this in like quantitative ways, and there's a clear difference between the way that people get treated if they are black, that people get treated once their provider knows that they might be LGBT. Like it's a real issue, and the problem, this is probably the greatest difficulty since the Civil Rights Act, is that none of these things anymore are, like there's not explicit racism to address. And so nobody wants to look at themselves and say, I have these implicit biases, and I am doing these things that are propagating these health disparities. But if you assess this quantitatively, it's almost always 90+% of physicians will come off with real clear markers of implicit bias in the way they treat their patients. So I think there has to be, it can't just be that we get a lot of black kids from Dudley to become medical students and become physicians and go out. That can't be it. Like that cannot be the way this works. Like there's, for every single like political movement, there's always been a huge need for allies. And I think as scientists, we have to start checking like our colleagues about like what are the things that they're doing to propagate this and how can they serve? Because like, I guarantee you, you could be a very, very good white physician in the black community. You do not have to be like a black doctor to treat black patients. And I would say that in my experience being in Boston, again, you can very easily tell if I'm at a hospital, a grocery store, a restaurant, whatever, in a black community, there's a very clear difference between the way that I get treated when I am in a service area in a predominantly white institution, and pretty much everybody I can think of that I've talked to about this sort of feels the same thing. So I think that probably the biggest issue, it's not just numbers, it's not just genetic data, it's not just who you enrolled, there has to be like some effort from the institution, and this is why I was trying to say, like, it can't just be students advocating for this, but people who run institutions, full professors, people who are big names at these places, have to start advocating for training in the institutions about how do you treat patients who are Haitian, who are first-generation immigrants, who don't speak English as their first language, because you cannot just plop a teacher from the suburbs into some school that's like in the inner city, right? Like that doesn't work at all, but like why do we allow people to come from medical schools all over the country with no background in the communities that live here and then go, okay, like you're chill, you had an hour conversation about what it means to move here from Haiti, so you're good to treat like anybody from that background. It's absurd, and I think that there needs to be some checking like from the institution to start addressing those things.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
I want to piggyback off your beginning statement. I don't know, I think I told the story when we all met the last time, but we all compare. We compare treatments. That's what we do, we compare. And when I was living in Houston, and I had my own breast cancer foundation, so a female, she came up to me, and she called me like 5 o'clock in the morning. She was telling me how she was sick, she was throwing up, she was in pain, and I told her, I said, okay, well, call your doctor. I'm gonna go with you to your doctor's appointment. I asked if it was okay. She stated yes. So when we got in the car, I went to go pick her up, got in the car, I told her, I said, hey, look, when we go here, ask your doctor to put you on steroids. My doctor put me on steroids. I didn't have no side effects. I didn't get sick. The only thing, of course, I experienced the hair loss, the tiredness from the chemotherapy, the black, my nails and everything turning black. But the nausea and the getting sick, I didn't have none of that. So we sit in the doctor's office, and she knows another lady that had the same doctor as her. She was a white female. So I'm very nosy. I love to talk to people. And so we sat there, and she's talking, and I said, yeah. I said, so do you ever get sick? And she was like, oh, no, the doctor put me on steroids. So I looked at I looked at the female like, you gonna tell me to put you on some steroids. So when we got in the office, and she was telling him the side effects, and he basically was like, okay, I'll be right back. So I said, when he come back in, tell him to put you on steroids. So when he came back in, she said, hey, can you put me on steroids? And the look on his face, he like he didn't want to do it. He did it, but he was looking like, how you know. So right there, yeah. So it's kind of like right there, I'm getting upset. I was getting mad. I'm from a little hood too now. So, I kind of got upset, and I asked like, wow, I just spoke with another female out there, and she was a Caucasian female, and she's getting the treatments that she needs and the stuff that won't have her sick as much, and whenever you're sick and in pain, you're upset. And well, why wasn't she getting the same thing? And he just basically blew me off because I wasn't his patient. I said, okay, no problem. So it's kind of like we all compare. So for a lot of you guys that's in school, think about that. You can't treat one patient, two patients a different way because we compare. We compare treatments.
So the hour's getting late. I want to ask one last question before we move to closing comments, which is about the 2 slides I showed. And I just wanted to get some reactions about, we're talking about these direct-to-patient projects as a way to address some of this, to a way to go directly into communities and have people participate directly and maybe bypass some of the institutional issues or the physician issues. And yet we see numbers that look exactly like in Rachel's presentations of her clinical trials, 92% white participation. Could you guys share some thoughts about whether you agree that this type of direct-to-patient approach can address these issues? And if so, then why aren't we doing all? What do we need to do next to help fix this?
Well, I think when we first started, I think we had, 30 African-American women, or was it 60 when I first, 60?
Yeah.
And when we said we had 100, I was like, that's actually good. But I think it's just going to be a process, and it's not going to be a quick fix process, but it's going to be a process. And when she was talking about websites and stuff, we had talked about websites, and when we went in, we said, that looks like a white woman on your website. So Black women are not going to be relatable to it, and you have to consider that too. So they changed it for us to make it look more universal, universal woman, I guess that's the word. And now, it's like, okay. So we look at that, when we go to the website and say, okay, well, do they really care? That looks like a white woman on a website. So, it's just a process, and it's going to be a process. I think that we just have to start doing more like newspaper articles and just get into the communities. Somebody asked me, well, do you know how many African-American women are MBC patients? And I thought that was a good question. I don't know, but I know there are more than 100, So it's going to, dealing with the African-American community is a process. And I think we could do it, though. I think we got a great team working with the Broad Institute and working with the MBC Project people, and working with Sean, giving me all this knowledge that I didn't know. I'm gonna be like, hey, that's what Sean said. But I just think it's a process, and it's not a quick process, but I think it's gonna happen.
Is the platform appropriately directed to the African American community? I'm not a social media person, I have to confess. I'm not on Facebook, Twitter, or anything else. But is the platform appropriately targeted to the population. So then I think the bigger question is how to do that.
It's not. It's, I'm gonna just say that.
That's what we need to hear.
So I would say that if you're going to really address the African American community, you're gonna need to go where they're at. You're gonna need to talk to the station managers that have radio stations that are in the Black community. You're gonna need to get into the Black newspaper, and you're gonna need to build a relationship with those particular leaders that are the voices in the community so that they will hear that. Here's the biggest issue is that we talk about MBC like everybody in the world knows what metastatic breast cancer is. Women and men don't even understand what is MBC. They say, oh, I had cancer and it spread to this particular area. Yeah. So next month, I'm having a forum and sending information out about what is metastatic breast cancer. And so then I have an explanation. This is what it is. It spread outside of the original site to a different site in your body so that I can get my community to understand what metastatic breast cancer is or metastatic cancer is so they'll understand when they hear that term. But we like to use initials, you know, because that's what the institutions use. They use initials. Well, the people out there, they don't know what the initials are.
Yeah.
Right. I think it's also really important when you're communicating what metastatic breast cancer is that it's incurable. We hear the word cure a lot, and it's true that early, cancers diagnosed early have a cure rate, and that's 5 years survival, and many patients go on to die of something else, but metastatic breast cancer is incurable, and we don't have any treatments for it. And I think that's really a critical part of your message about what is metastatic breast cancer, because I don't think people, not only do they not understand it, and I'm a scientific writer, and I find I'm always amazed that I still have to define what metastatic breast cancer is when I use the word metastasis, and it's just, it's not understood. And another big piece of that is we don't understand that people living with metastatic breast cancer are living on therapy for the rest of their lives, and that's a really big part of their stories.
If I may offer a couple recommendations for you guys to consider. So have you applied for a PCORI grant?
Not yet.
Yeah, so this is a perfect setup. So this is amazing work. It's perfect for submission for a PCORI grant. And the benefits of that is you actually then become part of PCOR net, where you can tap into other disease states who have already done this and be able to learn from them and how you might do some outreach to the African Americans or Hispanics or whoever you're trying to also kind of enrich the population. And then the other group that you might want to think about is the National Minority Quality Forum, right? Because that organization is about raising awareness and helping to around inclusion of the minorities into clinical trials. So just two suggestions.
Thanks. Well, we could have this discussion obviously for a lot longer, but we're going to have to close, and there's a reception afterwards. But Corey and I just wanted to say thanks to our panel. Corey, I don't know if you want to say 2 words.
I do. I just wanted to come up and thank each of you for being here. I want to thank everybody in the audience, especially those of you who came and asked really good questions. What I'm left with today is just, this overwhelming sense that there is so much to do, all of us. It's incumbent on all of us to open up our minds and understand where we may have implicit bias, whether we want to or not, understand where maybe we could help our colleagues come to realize how they could better engage with different communities, understand how we can talk better with patients and do right by different communities that are underrepresented, and really just do everything that we can to bring everybody along and move the whole state of research forward. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks. And so, just to close, we'll have Todd Golub give some closing remarks.
Thanks, Nick. I'm Todd Golub, Chief Scientific Officer at the Broad Institute. The hour is late, so I want to be very brief and end just by saying that such an amazing morning. I think I'll have to say from my own from my own perspective, I feel like I have a deeper sense of the issues than I did before, and I didn't expect to come out of this morning with that deeper sense. I want to thank a couple of people for today. Shades at Broad, very proud that Shades at Broad not only exists, it not only exists, but it's a strong and voice at the Broad, growing stronger, and so thank you very much. The Metastatic Breast Cancer Project, which I think is an example for the whole community around, in many dimensions, about what a great research project could look like and should look like. So I want to thank, in particular, Nick and Corey, and especially Elena Anastasio for making this event possible. I have an analogy that may or may not work, but I want to try it, because this week is, as you may have noticed, I am not African American. This week is Passover. And during Passover, those of us who are Jewish tell the story every year of the Jews being chased through the desert and trying to avoid persecution. And we're taught to tell this story not about what happened to them, those people thousands of years ago, but what happened to us. What this is about me, and we're invoked to make this very personal so that we take it as our challenge to fight for social justice and to do what's right. And I think that's part of the problem that we have here today. I suspect if I asked for a show of hands in this room or any other room of researchers or patients, who's in favor of racial disparities or discrimination against elderly patients or children who are also have the same set of challenges, kids with cancer, for example, very few hands would go up. But if I then said, how many of you believe that this is your problem to solve? Few hands would go up again. And I think this is what we need to, this is the problem we need to figure out how to crack. This needs to be a problem that all of us feel personal responsibility to solve. As institutions, we need to feel that it's our institutional responsibility to solve this. It's too easy to hide behind the fact that, well, yeah, the Broad isn't where, for example, isn't where we'd like to be with respect to diversity of our workforce, but we're no worse than other institutions in Boston or across the country. That's not okay. I think we need to, the Broad is known for many things, great technology, generating data, and so on, but in the end, I think we'll be known for what we stand for. And this needs to be one of the things that we stand for and not just talk about, but figure out in ways that, honestly, I'm not sure how to do yet, but some way we need to actually act and try to lead to address this really important set of questions. So I'm grateful that this conversation has started, and I very much hope that it's going to continue not only here, but across the country, and I want to thank everybody for participating. Thank you.
And then let's just have one more round of applause for our panel who came from far and wide.